Most of us have wanted to change something about ourselves at some point in our lives. Stop a negative habit, start a positive habit, improve a positive quality in ourselves, or reduce a negative quality. And some of us want to make changes like this on a larger scale, in our family, our team, company, or organization, our community, our country, or even the world. In some cases, making the change can be as simple as figuring out what needs to be done and doing it. But what happens when you struggle to implement a change? What's going on? And how do you fix it? I invite you to pause the video right now and think of a change that you want to implement, either personally in your life or at a larger scale, a group you're a part of, your company, your country, or even the world. Then, as you watch the video, keep this change in mind and think about how these concepts might apply to it. Okay, so this is how I usually visualize how change works. I call it the change graph. The basic formula is size of change times current comfort level equals energy required. The size of the change is literally the displacement from the current path. It can be measured in degrees of difference from current direction. Most people can reasonably handle about 3 degrees of change at a time. The current comfort level is regarding whatever problem the change is designed to solve. Comfort level effectively equates to the level of inertia. If the current level of comfort is high, then chances are the problem isn't really experienced as a problem, so the subconscious is going to be averse to the change and resist it. The energy required is literally the energy that must be expended to successfully make the change. This can be any kind of energy, or a combination of kinds of energy, including physical energy, mental energy, emotional energy, magical energy, etc. In many cases, the energy will need to be expended over some period of time. The reason being that the subconscious will often try to pull things back to the previous status quo for a period of time, and this includes the subconscious minds of anyone involved with or affected by the change, like family, friends, and coworkers. The period of time before the subconscious recognizes the change as the new normal and stops resisting it seems to be, on average, a little over 2 months, but it can vary widely. I've personally found that for something I do every day, it can take between 3 weeks to 3 months to become normal. But even then, I can still slip up if I'm changing something that was a firmly ingrained habit before then. In some cases, instead of expending the required energy slowly over time, a lot of the energy can be applied quickly all at once in one heroic push. This typically works better for changes that are difficult to reverse, like moving somewhere. In this equation, energy required refers to the total amount of energy necessary, regardless of how quickly or slowly it is used. I recently realized that this equation bears a striking resemblance to the physics equation work equals force dot displacement. S stands for displacement. This is literally the size of the resulting change. F stands for force. This is the force necessary to overcome things like inertia and friction. W stands for work. And in physics, energy and work use the same units. If you exert the right amount of energy, the work gets done. So back to our graph, simply put, if the energy you apply to the change is equal to or greater than the energy required, you will succeed in making the change. And the energy you apply requires both the capacity to reserve that amount of energy for making the change and the decision to direct this energy into making the change. Often this decision needs to be repeatedly made over the period of time required to make the change. And remember, this all works exactly the same at a larger scale. It doesn't matter how big the group of people is, it's still made of people. A group of people will find a small change easier to make than a large change, just as an individual would. A group of very comfortable people will most likely be very resistant to change, but a group of people in desperate circumstances will be very motivated to make a change. And energy is required to make a change, whether that energy is being expended by an individual or by a group. So if you're having trouble making a change, whether personal or at a larger scale, you can adjust any or all of the three components of this equation. You can decrease the size of the change, for example, by breaking it up into baby steps. You can decrease the current comfort level by changing the mental context, for example, by journaling and getting deeply honest about the costs of staying on the present path and not making the change. The psychological and emotional discomfort from this kind of honesty can be very effective at providing the necessary motivation. At a larger scale, it's a good idea to pay attention to the stages of consciousness that people are at. Stage-appropriate strategies can be employed to help people recognize discomfort and become motivated by it. For example, at orange stage, one rhetoric technique that works really well is pain, action, result. Describe the problem vividly and with facts and figures, then make the call to action, then describe what the result will be vividly and with facts and figures. At green or yellow stage, on the other hand, you want people to be more personally involved and proactive. This is where employing something like the core commitments and the core protocols, a system developed by Jim and Michelle McCarthy, can be very helpful. I'll provide a link below. If each person gets their own alignment, they can then view the team or the company or organization through the lens of their own alignment. They'll be able to see problems for themselves, possibly even ones you didn't see, as well as solutions. And they'll be very motivated to make those changes happen. And with the rest of the core protocols and commitments, they'll be empowered to do so. If you're using psychological methods like these, repeated reminders of the context may be necessary to maintain the required level of discomfort throughout the period of time necessary to make the change. Here, I want to take a moment to address language. We naturally have a negative connotation with the word discomfort, but discomfort is required for making change. If you want change, you'll need some discomfort. However, if you don't want to use negative language, you can use positive language instead. For example, you can talk in terms of inspiration. Increasing inspiration for a future state is a way to decrease comfort about the present state. If you really thought the present state was absolutely perfect and couldn't be improved on in any way, then you wouldn't find something else inspiring. So instead of focusing on present discomfort, you can vividly imagine how great the future state is after having made the change and then live into that future. In fact, this tends to work even better for the subconscious. I talk about this in the affirmations and manifestations video, which I'll link below. Another very effective way to decrease the comfort level is by changing the physical context. For example, if you want to become vegan and you move to a vegan community, it's going to suddenly become very uncomfortable to continue trying to eat animal foods. For one thing, there might not be any animal foods available to eat unless you start eating bugs. Introducing this kind of discomfort can make it much easier to make the change. Or in terms of larger scope, for example, a company, you can start hiring people who already do the practices you're wanting to shift toward. And you can even ask their advice in making those changes, which actually applies to the next section. Just be aware that if you're increasing the level of discomfort by a lot, you will get change, but it might not be the change that you were expecting. You can also increase the capacity for change. In other words, the energy available to apply to the change. You can do this by increasing the overall energy available, for example, by caring for physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual health, or by reducing other drains on energy for the time period necessary to make the change, or by getting help, like asking inner guidance, or learning from experts about how to make this kind of change, or hiring a teacher, a coach, or a consultant, or roping in friends or coworkers for external accountability. This is the same at a larger scale too, making sure everyone involved is well cared for and getting extra help for making the change. Or another way to increase capacity is to become a person or group of people, if you're working at a larger scale, for whom this kind of change is easy, like by doing consciousness progression and or spiritual development work. I have several playlists that help with this kind of thing, including the consciousness progression playlist, the communicating among yourselves playlist, the shadow work playlist, and the spiritual development playlist. I've put links to all of these in the description box below as well. On a team scale, the core protocols and commitments that I mentioned before are very helpful for this too. There are actually limitless ways to adjust the components of this equation. The examples I listed are just a few to give you an idea of the kinds of things I'm talking about. And I find that changes are much easier to implement when I adjust all three of these components, sometimes using multiple methods for each one. If the size of the change is small and the current comfort level regarding the problem is low, and there's plenty of energy capacity available and it's being applied, then the change is inevitable. For example, if I'm walking and I have a big rock in my shoe, very low level of comfort regarding the problem, and the solution is to remove the rock, small change, and I have the capacity to do so, as in I can stop walking and take off my shoe, then you can bet I'm going to take the rock out of my shoe. But maybe this example is too insignificant to be able to see how to apply these principles to harder changes. One of the hardest kinds of changes is to stop an addiction. So one place to look for effective ways to make changes is in 12-step programs. They decrease the size of the change, they focus on one day at a time, and there are 12 steps, not one. They decrease the current comfort level. The work recommended for step 1 often involves journaling deeply about the costs of addiction in one's life. They also often recommend avoiding the people and places that make the addiction easy, and going to at least one meeting a day for 90 days in order to change one's environment and be around other people who are doing this work. This changes the physical context, introducing a positive kind of discomfort. And they increase the person's capacity. Many 12-step programs emphasize finding effective top lines, self-care practices that increase one's capacity in general. They also recommend getting a sponsor, a person who has been through the program themselves and who can coach the sponsee through it, which is a form of help. Most importantly, the 12 steps themselves are actually designed to help the person transform into someone for whom it is easier to stay sober through both spiritual development work and consciousness development work like shadow work. On a group scale, actually a great example is getting your team to use the core protocols and the core commitments. And I've had success in using this formula to do just that, by breaking the core protocols down into baby steps and introducing one protocol at a time. You can pick the lowest hanging, tastiest fruit, the protocol that will be a small change and take very little effort, and that will immediately solve a very painful problem for the team. I found that as the team starts to see and experience the benefits of each protocol as it's introduced, they become eager for more. I've also noticed that the effects can be contagious as other teams notice how much better your team is performing and start to get curious about what's going on over there. This is actually another way to break the change down into smaller steps. make the change in part of the group if working at a group scale, or in part of your life if working at an individual scale. This video was a quick overview of this approach. There are limitless ways to implement it, as I've mentioned, and I've experimented with lots, many of which I've had great success with. I recommend experimenting, perhaps by using the technique from the How to Learn video, which I'll also link below. Have fun!